Thank you all for coming this evening, and thank you, Wendy. I'm delighted to be here. As Wendy mentioned, I was steeped in Montessori growing up. I went to Montessori primary. My mother, during my middle childhood years, was writing a book on Montessori that came out of her master's thesis. She was later a Montessori teacher and opened a Montessori school. And when I was in my mid-20s, my career was to be a technical writer, to write computer manuals. And I decided to take a brief break from that and take a Montessori training course on infant development. And in the course of taking this training, I started to really wonder, what do we know about children versus what were Montessori's ideas about children versus what were the ideas of this trainer? It all seemed blended together. And meanwhile, there was so much enthusiasm about Montessori that sometimes I would sit back and really wonder. At home, at the dinner table, by this time, 2 of my sisters had taken Montessori training, and my mother had opened a school, and they were all working in it. And there was such a religious fervor about it at times, which if you've been around Montessori people much, you know that there's so much enthusiasm it can take on a religious fervor. And I really wondered. So I was a bit skeptical and decided that I wanted to go to graduate school and find out what we really knew about child development. And at that point, I was convinced that although Montessori surely had its strengths, other forms of education would too, and that probably the most optimal form of education would combine strengths of different systems. I didn't understand at that point what a system Montessori is, and that you can't just kind of pluck out parts without losing something important about the whole. So I started graduate school with the aim to learn more about child development and education, but soon got kind of sidetracked into learning about children's theories of mind. When I had my own children, however, I knew enough studies that supported Montessori to want to send them to Montessori school. And the process after that was learning more and more about Montessori, educating myself more and more by reading her books and by talking to people. And also, meanwhile, through my profession, learning more and more about studies about child development. And I became increasingly impressed by the convergences, by how this woman 100 years ago, simply by watching children, arrived at so many of the same conclusions that our careful scientific research is reaching today. So at one point, I simply had to write this book, just write these things down. What I didn't expect would happen in the course of writing this book was that I would become increasingly disturbed by traditional education and by what we usually do with children in schools. And before I move into that, though, I just want to mention, while this talk is based on this book, whenever I look at the book, I feel a little distressed because there's so much more in the book than I can possibly tell you in an hour's talk. So let me just say, if you like the talk, you'll love the book. Go buy it. But so traditional education, then, I started to feel increasingly distressed about. And I wondered, what is it, given that these studies that I'm going to tell you about tonight and many more that are in the book are common parlance if you're a psychologist or if you're in a school of education. You know these studies. Why don't we incorporate these findings more in how we educate children day to day? And thinking about this, I came across this notion of there being 2 poor models. Different people talk about one or the other of these models, but if you pull them together, it becomes very powerful in terms of the reason why traditional schools have so much trouble changing. And when educators are always coming up with new programs for schools, they don't get down to these foundational models. So the first foundational model is the school as a factory. When mass public education was established in this country around the turn of the last century, we were in an era when we were simply enamored with the idea of efficiency. So if you've read Cheaper by the Dozen, the original book by Frank Gilbreth, he was a real guy, and his wife was a real woman, and they really had 12 children, and they were really traveling around the world advising people on how to do things more efficiently. And that was the call of the nation. How can we be more efficient in everything, including these schools that we were establishing? And so when you go back to the literature of the time that schools of education were just being established around this country, then when you read the people's writing, they actually referred to schools as plants. They referred to children as raw materials, and they referred to teachers as mid-level managers. And the job of the teacher was to transform the children through taking them through this factory-like structure. So, you've got the bells that ring at 50 minutes, whether the teacher's ready for it to end and the children are ready for it to end or not. You've got children moving from room to learn different subjects. Just as in a factory, the automobile moves from place to get different parts attached. Many of the features of our traditional schools come from this factory model, children going in lockstep through the curriculum and so on. Second poor model that underlies traditional schooling is the behaviorist model of the child, or the child is a blank slate. This is the idea that all children are the same and the teacher gets them to learn by giving them information, by essentially writing information on their brains. And the way that the teacher can get that information in best by a behaviorist model is through rewards and punishment. And so extrinsic rewards are very essential in traditional schools. You have grades, you give children good grades when they do well, you give them poor grades when they do poorly, you also have demerits and detention and the like. It's based on these extrinsic systems. And the school as factory and the child as a blank slate actually really work hand in hand. They very much mutually reinforce each other, as I discuss more in the book. So these are two very poor models, however, for how children learn, because if you think about the principles I'll be talking about in my talk tonight for how children learn, many of them are very difficult to implement in a factory structure or when you've got a model of the child as a blank slate to be written on. How would you do it differently? If you wanted to design schools that would work for children, that would work the way that children learn, what would you do? Well, I think you would perhaps do what Maria Montessori did, which is you would watch children and you would design your system of schooling based on children and how they learn rather than based on cultural zeitgeist that adults had invented. Maria Montessori lived from 1870 to 1952. She was the first woman in Italy to obtain the physician's degree, which was in 1896. It was against all odds. She graduated at the top of her class, gave a great lecture, the honorary lecture that the top person in the class always got to give. And by 1904, she was a professor at the University of Rome. She was also a world-renowned lecturer on women's rights, traveling all over giving lectures. She was seeing patients. She was teaching classes. She was also the head of a psychiatric clinic. And at this time in Italy, children who were mentally retarded were placed in psychiatric clinics along with adults who had all kinds of psychiatric problems. And Montessori watched these children in these asylums and decided that they were really starved for stimulation. And she took some materials that Itard, who had worked with the Wild Boy of Aveyron, and his follower Sigan had started to develop. And she worked with these sensorial materials, which are an early version of the sensorial materials in Montessori classrooms today. And the children started to advance more and more as they worked with these materials. One day she decided she wanted to give them the tests, the state exams that they were already giving to Italian children at this time. So she gave them these tests, and lo and behold, these mentally retarded children passed the tests that were for normal school children in Italy. And it was headlines all over the world. This Italian miracle worker has caused these mentally deficient, as they called them, children to pass the normal exams. And it was just a big buzz. Everybody was wild about what she had done with these children to make them seem so intelligent. But her reaction was different. She said instead, what in the world is wrong with our traditional schools that these normal children with perfectly well-functioning brains aren't doing any better than these mentally retarded children on these tests? So although she was very busy at the time, she was, as I said, a professor, head of this clinic, seeing patients, she decided she wanted to go back to school. So at the same time that she's doing all these other things, she's going and taking classes in anthropology and in education, and she's going into the Roman schools and observing children. At the time, they're on benches that are nailed to the floor and they can't move, and the whip is coming out and the like. So she's observing these things and trying to think, what could we do better here? She wanted to work with children in elementary school, since that's when compulsory education began, but the Italian state wouldn't allow her to do that. Instead, a friend of the family, as the story goes, had been renovating apartment buildings in a very poor section of Rome, and they had a problem during the day. During the day, the children 6 and older were in school, and the infants were with their grandmothers, but their parents, who were among the very poor working class of Italy, were off at work. So these children from 2 to 6 were running around, defacing the walls, making a mess of these newly renovated apartment buildings. And they said to her, would you come in and work with these children? Well, she'd wanted to work with older children, but she conceded and said, okay. And actually, it's quite fortuitous that it worked that way. The first Casa de Bambini then opened almost 100 years ago in January of 1907. And she opened it with these materials, and she would devise new materials, try new things. The teacher in the classroom was an uneducated woman. She would give her advice about what to do, and then she'd go off to her other jobs, checking in here and there and observing to see what was happening. And miracles happened, so that once again, it was not long before this was newspaper articles the world over, and people, kings and queens were coming to visit and the like. And in fact, here in Charlottesville, just 5 short years later, there was already an open-air Montessori school on the lawn at the university. So it traveled quickly. Here is the first Casa de Bambini as it looked in 2002 when I was giving a talk down the street at the University of Rome, and I mentioned I was working on this book. They said, oh, the first school is right down the street. Mussolini closed all the schools in the 1930s, but this original one has reopened as a Montessori school. So let's talk a little bit about this system. One thing that's very important about Montessori is she was so amazed about what happened in that classroom that she left all of her other positions and devoted the rest of her life, so 50 years in total, to developing this system. There aren't many educational systems that one person focused on so intensely for so long. In fact, I think it's probably the only one. She worked on 3 different continents, as far away as India. She worked in the United States a bit, and many countries in Europe. She worked with all social classes, starting with lower and then all through as she went on. And she also developed a system for children from birth through age 12, and she had ideas about adolescence and was starting to develop those further when she passed away. So one person, so many years, all these ages and all this breadth. This is a Montessori classroom in Kyoto, Japan. That's me with another developmental psychologist a few years ago. And I like to show it because it shows that Montessori classrooms look pretty much the same anywhere you go. The main difference here is they have sandpaper characters instead of sandpaper letters. But they have the same materials and the like. The classroom demographics in a Montessori classroom are quite different from the way that we sense traditional schools should be, particularly at the kindergarten age. There will be 3-year age groupings in Montessori all the way through, including at elementary. So 3 to 6, 6 to 9, 9 to 12 are the periods that Montessori saw working well. There will be 1 teacher and often also an assistant, especially in primary. And there will be a fairly large number of children, so 25 to 35 children. And later I'll address why this is considered good in a Montessori context. The environment is very carefully prepared, so the teachers go through a lot of thought about just where to put different materials, different rooms, areas of the room, house different materials, and the teachers think through very carefully, even within a material, just how to lay things out and just the exact steps that a child will go through to use it. The curriculum is interconnected across different topic areas and across levels. So what a child learns in math will relate to what they're learning in history, and this is all intentionally done, unlike in a factory style where the teachers have trouble communicating these things to each other, and where the textbooks and all change each year, and that's difficult to do. In Montessori, it's simply part of the program. The curriculum is also interconnected across levels, so what a child learns when they're 3 is going to be connected to what they're learning at 5 and 7 and 9 and so on, which is possible because one person was really instrumental in developing it. And then finally, the materials are experimentally developed. So Montessori would bring a material in and would watch the children with the material and see if it really engaged them, if it really seemed to inspire them. And if it didn't, it would go in the dumpster that night and she would work on something else. So she would do this experimentally and very carefully. And for this reason, too, there's some points where, for example, the beads she first thought would be good for 8-year-olds, and then one day some 4-year-olds walked into the room and started using them, and she thought, So it was very much through watching children and responding to children that the system developed. The teacher's role in a Montessori classroom is also very different from what it is in a traditional classroom. The teacher is responsible for observing children very, very carefully and being very sensitive to where each child is, when they're ready for another lesson, when they need more guidance, when they need less guidance, and so on. And it's also to connect the children to the materials, because the children's learning comes from repeated use of the materials. One of the important principles in Montessori is the principle of free choice, that the child comes into the room each day and decides what they want to do. The children come up with the ideas of what to study and so on, and I'll talk more about this momentarily. Repetition is another very important principle. So the first time a child does something, the first time they write an essay, they might not do it exactly right. They might not punctuate things right. They might not use the material correctly. But through repeated use of the material, learning develops. Finally, another important principle in Montessori is concentration. Montessori thought that concentration was extremely important. She saw personality changes develop in children as they began to concentrate and focus. And there is research in psychology suggesting that she was right on this. So when teachers rate children who are very self-regulated in the classroom, and then independently their parents rate how empathetic they are, the same children are rated as being high on both dimensions, even though different people are rating them. So this supports Montessori's notion that children, when they begin to concentrate and regulate their attention, start to do what she called normalization and become easier to work around, nicer, and so on. Another piece of evidence supporting this is rhesus monkeys that are raised in captivity are thought to be natural models for ADHD. They're difficult to work around, they're all over the place, they're also a bit aggressive. But when they're trained to use flight simulators, joysticks, and they have to concentrate a lot, people say their personalities change. They become nicer to work around, they become more focused in general, and it changes them. So that's support for Montessori's notion that concentration really can change human beings.